Welcome everyone to ELPC Thinks. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. And ELPC Thinks is where we bring together experts, environmental leaders, community partners to develop and forge new strategies for progress. Quick heads up, we're taping this webinar. We're streaming it live on Facebook, and we'll share it with those folks who can't join us. I'm tremendously pleased to welcome today Jigar Shah, who's Director of the Loan Program Office at the Department of Energy and a proud graduate of the University of Illinois. Welcome home, Jigar. Jigar was most recently a co-founder and president at Generate Capital, where he focused on helping entrepreneurs accelerate decarbonization solutions through the use of low-cost infrastructure as a service financing. Jigar has been involved on pay-as-you-save financing for solar. After his tour of duty at SunEdison, he served as the CEO of the Carbon War Room. He's run a great podcast and a great set of conversations on clean energy that many of us have engaged in. And we're going to have a conversation today. I think you'll be really interested to hear what Jigar has to say, and particularly in light of both the $40 billion or so that is still in the loan program office and what may be more to come. You know, I think it's going to be pretty darn interesting and important for clean energy and for climate change solutions. So Jigar, welcome, and a softball. Can you tell people what the loan program office does? There are 100 plus people on the call today. Some of them know, a lot of them don't.
Well, Howard, thanks for having me on, and thanks for your leadership. I'm, as you know, I grew up in Chicago and then Sterling, Illinois, and have worked largely outside of Illinois. And I think due to your leadership and the leadership of ELPC, I think you've seen a huge renaissance of clean energy investments happening in the Midwest and across the region. And just really thank you for all of that hard work. It was a lot of years in the making, as we know. The Loan Programs Office was really started by Pete Domenici back in 2005, in the Energy Act of 2005. It was enhanced in 2007 and then fully funded in the ERA stimulus bill in 2009 under Obama's first term. We put out about $35 billion out the door at a time when commercial debt was hard to get because of the financial crisis, to solar and wind projects, a nuclear project, transmission, geothermal, and most famously Tesla. So, you know, a lot of really good work that we've done. The losses we've had in the portfolio, which have been talked about a lot, have been quite modest. We've allocated about $6 billion for losses out of the portfolio, which is around 20% of the portfolio. And I think the total losses we've had are about 1.02 billion, which is about 1/6 of that amount of money. And I think, you know, popular press aside, I think the vast majority of people now believe that we haven't taken enough risk in supporting innovation going to the marketplace. Today, we've got about $44 billion of money left in 3 programs. Title 17, which is really the project finance side of the house. And then you've got ATVM, which is the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program, which is where a lot of the electric vehicle manufacturing support comes from. Battery manufacturing, we've got 5 gigafactories that have been submitted. We've got critical minerals, so a lot of the lithium, the recycling, the graphite. There's a lot of different approaches to critical minerals the president has pursued, comes out of there as well. And then the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program, where we're helping tribes take advantage of the wealth creation opportunities of this area. So it's been a real pleasure getting to know the program and making the minor fixes required to get people in the door. Today, we have about $90 billion of active loan applications that have either been received or should be received in the next few months. We've seen early drafts. 115, that's across 115 applicants. So it's roughly $750 million per loan application. And, you know, we're averaging about $1.6 billion a week in new loan applicants.
Well, the clean energy sector is exploding. I mean, if we go back to 2005, when the Loan Program Office was created, or even the beginning of the Obama administration, there is a lot of innovation happening, a lot of companies coming into the market. I mean, over the last decade, it's exploded. So how do you keep staying at the edge of innovation? How do you build bankability for those projects that are not, they could probably be done without the loans program office, but you're providing a bridge to bankability for new innovations, new programs, new projects that are importantly needed as climate solutions, and you can make a real difference.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think it gets very confusing very quickly. So let me maybe start with the macro and then maybe get to the micro. I think in general, people want to get to the micro and really get to a specific loan, which I'm happy to do. But I think we want to start by saying what we're most proud of from the 2010-2011 timeframe is that really $1 trillion has gone into solar and wind since we made our loans. Right, when you think about how much solar and wind were added to the grid last year, it was almost 25% of all cumulative installations in the United States happened last year, right? And so when you think about what the bridge to bankability is, it's not really about the projects that we fund. It's really about catalyzing $100 billion to $1 trillion of capital long-term, because I think we can all agree now that to be able to get to the decarbonization goals of 2035 in electricity and the full economy by 2050, we're talking about $1 trillion scale. The same thing's true with Tesla. The $460 million loan that we provided is great, and we're very proud of that. But the fact that we've reached $1 trillion scale now, not only in their stock, but also in the sector with Ford and everyone else making big decisions, is really what we're going for, right? And so we can actually do a loan for a specific company, for a specific project, and make it work, right? They hit the innovation targets, they hit some of the other targets that we have, greenhouse gas emission savings. But we're not inclined to do so unless we believe it catalyzes the next 50 projects after it, because that's how you get to gigaton scale. You don't get to gigaton scale by one project getting done and then nothing following after that, right? And so part of, I think, what we're acknowledging is in the United States, we don't have a top-down program, not like you have in Canada or Germany. Like our program here is really led by private sector capital formation. And what we do is we encourage that private sector capital formation through tax credits that we provide, through the Congress. We provide demonstration grants. We got $21.5 billion out of the bipartisan infrastructure deal for demonstration grants and hydrogen, carbon sequestration, storage, transmission, and batteries. And then the loan programs that I'm running, which is great. And then we've got federal procurement that's coming out as well for Buy America and some of the other pieces, right? And so I think what we do very carefully is make sure that the loans that we're offering are really viewed within the totality of that catalyst function, because there's just never going to be enough money at the loan programs office or at the other parts of the government to solve the entire problem on our own.
Leverage, leverage, leverage.
Yeah.
Where are the sectors that you're looking at when you say catalyst? Which sectors are you looking at and saying, here's where the loans program office can really make a difference, as you're putting it, I think, right, Jigar, not just on one project or two, but to really catalyze things to move forward? What's sort of in your mindset of, here are the best opportunities?
Yeah, I think that, so the Department of Energy has been doing a lot of work in this Emerald Future study, right, to figure out what do we need to decarbonize the grid by 2035, or the Princeton study, as you've seen, or the UC Berkeley study that Sonia Agarwal worked on before she joined the White House, or others, right? So there's lots of different models out there. I think all of the models show a few things, right? One is we need a lot more transmission, right? Like if we're going to build a high renewable energy penetration grid, we need to be able to move those electrons around, and that's how you get better stability of the grid. Right? Otherwise, you have to build 2 days of battery storage at every single location to be able to get these, 20%, 30%, 40% capacity factor projects to actually operate as though they're 80% capacity factor projects, which is pretty expensive. So you either put more transmission in, or you put a lot more long duration storage in? And the answer is you probably put a little bit of both, right? So those are two sectors we certainly need to scale up tremendously. And we've got right of ways with DOT, Department of Transportation, that they're providing. We have the 1222 authority that we've gotten out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I think some of the other areas is, overproducing electricity from renewable energy is a feature, not a bug, as you know. And that's leading to negative priced wholesale power in some LMPs. And so a lot of what we're looking at is putting in hydrogen, because we already use 10 million tons of hydrogen a year in the United States, most of it from fossil sources. And if we can convert just that into low carbon hydrogen, then we're far better off, right? So I think that's another earth shot that the Secretary has announced. I think, we also are looking at carbon negative technologies. I think there's a lot of folks who dislike CCS technologies, and I certainly understand that. But I think that where we are today is, even if we got almost all of our emissions down to zero, which you and I both know is going to take time, we're still going to have a bunch of CO2 in the air that we're going to have to remove if we actually want to get down to 1.5 degrees. And so there's a lot of work happening there right now. Fully scalable technologies out of industrial CCS are probably $350 a ton. And we're getting that down to $100 a ton by 2030, right? And the list goes on. We've got $5 billion of projects in sustainable aviation fuels that all the major airlines have now announced that they're going to use. The ETVM program has been expanded to be able to fund electric airplanes, as well as locomotives, as well as heavy and medium duty trucks. So we've got a lot of applications in there. We're seeing a tremendous amount of synergy between the fracking technology from the last 10 years and advanced geothermal technologies. And so you're seeing a lot of advanced geothermal technologies leveraging that old fracking technology to be able to unlock some of our geothermal potential, which I think we've all talked about for 15 years, but I think we're now on track to unlocking it. And so the list goes on, but I'd say there are probably 17 sectors or so that have been identified by Gina McCarthy in the Climate Office in the National Climate Strategy.
Talk a little bit about hydrogen. In the Midwest, tremendous amount of negative pricing, that if the nuclear plants run 24/7,
yeah,
and wind is running principally 70% at night, 30% during the day, you have a huge amount of, in effect, must run between wind and nuclear, and there's not much demand at night. Now, over time, if you have time of use pricing for electric vehicles, there are things you can do to shift some load, but at least in the short or near term, a lot of
I think
pricing. How does hydrogen play into that? And we're all pretty excited about it. Talk a little bit about it, would you?
Sure. I mean, I do think that hydrogen is a very difficult thing for people to wrap their brain around. But I think what's easier for people to wrap their brain around is fertilizer, right? We don't make enough fertilizer in this country to meet all of our needs. So our incremental fertilizer comes from the Ukraine. We get it from the Ukraine, we ship it to Tampa, Florida. We then put it in a pipeline from Tampa, Florida to Louisiana. And then we put it into a pipeline from Louisiana up to the Midwest. Right. You can imagine the carbon footprint of that ammonia is pretty high. Yep. And so the question becomes, if you have excess power generation from must-run plants, particularly in the PJM, but also in MISO, and you're in a situation where you can actually turn that cost effectively into hydrogen. Today, it's pretty straightforward to make hydrogen that's clean at $5 a kilogram, right? That's really straightforward, I'd say. We've got a lot of applications in the Loan Programs Office that do that right now. And the Secretary believes, just through learning curve impacts, that when we have 6 or 7 cumulative doublings of deployment, we're going to get down to about $2 a kilogram pretty easily. So pretty easily, right? And the $2 to $1, which is the goal that she announced, will take some additional innovation. But DOE is very good at innovation. So if we can get from 5 to 2, that means we now can ship clean hydrogen into clean fertilizer for markets in the Midwest without having to bring it in from the Ukraine. So you're onshoring that capacity, creating all those jobs here. but you're also taking what is basically, a bit of a struggle for the electricity industry, which is persistently low prices. So it makes it hard for generators to make money. And it means that ratepayers in Illinois have to subsidize the nuclear plants, right? If we can actually create more demand for the electricity, which is what this would do, you could decarbonize hydrogen and the fertilizer industry, but also you could actually create lower electricity bills because the denominator is larger for electricity sales, right? And you could actually reduce the subsidies required for those nuclear plants.
And because that's the big challenge here. There's a lot of wind power. It's running mostly at night. Wind generators are incentivized to run, otherwise they don't get the PTC. The nuclear plants are operating 24/7. You can't cycle a nuclear plant very effectively. So there's that opportunity there of all that generation and what to do with it. Who's talking about conversion into fertilizer? I mean, I've heard people talk about it. We've had a number of technical meetings on it. You're talking about this morning. How widespread is that conversation in the industry?
Well, the hydrogen conversation is very widespread, right? We have $500 billion of announcements that have already been made in the United States by different people. In the Midwest, I'd say like North Dakota has been very clear about the fact that they have a $5 billion approach to hydrogen production, and converting that to fertilizer is probably the way to get the best compensation for that hydrogen. But separately, Louisiana, right? Air Products made that big announcement with the state of Louisiana around turning all of their gray hydrogen sites into low carbon hydrogen there. And then they already have the pipeline to ship ammonia from Louisiana up to the Midwest, right? I think you've got similar conversations happening in Nebraska, some conversations happening in Iowa. But honestly, I would say that the biggest challenge that we have is that the United States has a hard time with these really complex conversations. And one of the great places to have this conversation is frankly with the natural gas utility. Because the natural gas utility, right, today has a critical role to play in heating people's homes and making sure businesses run. But I think we all know that natural gas has to be managed effectively to meet our 2035 and 2050 goals. But you already have a public-private partnership built in to the natural gas utility. And so if they wanted to rate base a lot of this equipment for fertilizer production, they could do that. And they could create a nexus between the electric utility industry and the natural gas industry where they're part of the solution as opposed to being demonized by a lot of players.
Here, I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that people have posted in the chat box.
Sure.
For example, can the loan program office support pay-as-you-save programs for residential electric school buses? Is that within your portfolio capacity, or that's really somewhere else in the federal government?
Yeah, so we can. So we're already actively talking to the large money center banks on Wall Street because, as you know, the pay-as-you-save program is getting quite big for residential solar. We're at $1.5 billion a month of that paper. And a lot of those same companies are expanding into HVAC financing for heat pumps. And so they're looking to get to $5 billion a month next year. And when you look at what they're doing, they're inadvertently leaving out many Americans because Wall Street is negatively biased towards people that have below 650 FICO scores who have some of these other characteristics. And the data shows that, in fact, people with those characteristics pay their bills on time, right? That this is not the same as, healthcare debt, which is what they're comparing it to. These are essential services that people are willing to pay on time. And so we're stepping in with loan guarantees to help Wall Street get comfortable with broadening these services to all Americans and not just a subset of Americans, which of course the solar financing industry is happy to serve all Americans. They really take their cues from where they can securitize their debt. So there's a lot of work going on there, but same with commercial industrial solar, rooftop solar, that kind of stuff. We're seeing a lot of interest there in the pay-as-you-save model. And we can finance that as well. On electric buses, we can do that as well. But what I would say is that there's some rebates, obviously, in the bipartisan infrastructure deal that was passed for electric buses. I think it was roughly $2.5 billion for electric buses. But you could imagine some of the charging infrastructure is not covered. And then also the infrastructure to connect the buses to the emergency centers so that you can use the batteries as, basically effectively diesel generators for the emergency centers, with companies like Nuvi and others who have that implementation. So you can imagine people getting electric buses, but not having the money to do the rest of the implementation. So that rest of the implementation can easily be borrowed from our office. So we can do both. We can do fleet deployments as well as credit enhancement for pay-as-you-save products.
Let's turn over to geothermal. There's a lot of interest in the Midwest, as you know, and you're right. For many years, there's been interest, but there hasn't been that much movement. And indeed, in Western Illinois, Eastern Iowa, there's some really good geothermal hotspots that are not known by many, but if you check the maps, there it is. Talk about your thinking of how we accelerate, how you catalyze geothermal investment.
Yeah, we certainly have a lot of research and development programs here at the Department of Energy that people have taken advantage of. But one thing I think is very important to note is when you look at the modeling work on decarbonization, this whole concept of flexible baseload, which has been, bandied about now with low impact hydro, BECCS, biomass, advanced geothermal, and nuclear. When you take the trade-offs, right? So you've got either you build a lot more transmission to do very high penetrations of solar and wind, or you put in a lot of long duration storage, right, to be able to handle that, or you actually just have more flexible baseload. It turns out you can easily pay 7 cents a kilowatt hour for flexible baseload because that ends up being cheaper than solar and wind plus 2 days of storage. And so I think part of what we need to do is to educate public service commissions because they've gotten so addicted to very low levelized cost of energy that they haven't really realized what it's going to take and what mix it takes to get to zero emissions by 2035. And when you think about what we can afford to do, it sounds expensive to pay 7 cents a kilowatt hour, which is where geothermal is today. But it's not expensive with all of the services you provide. 20% of the entire electricity bill that you pay for today is really grid balancing services. And these are payments that we make to natural gas peaker plants, to lots of other assets. And they can actually be taken on by demand flexibility, right, from appliances and electric vehicles, as well as from flexible baseload power plants and central battery storage. And so I think part of this is taking that $80 billion a year that we're spending on those services and starting to allocate it to some of these other assets in ways that are more direct, as opposed to, just saying lowest levelized cost of energy wins.
The former Illinois House Speaker used to say that whenever a bill drops in Springfield, there are immediately 150 lobbyists scurrying around, and they're all looking at the legislation, and their question is, what's wrong in this for my client, as opposed to what's right in it. So on the geothermal acceleration, who looks at that and says, that's bad for us? Where does the opposition come from in geothermal? Who feels threatened by it?
Honestly, I don't think anyone feels threatened by geothermal. I think that the fracking companies would love to provide drilling rigs to the geothermal providers to do their work. There's certainly a lot of oil and gas workers who've been displaced who would love to get jobs in this area. There's a lot of unions involved who, love this work. I think that, I think there's a lot of benefits. I think the biggest problem is it really does. The PPA is required to 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour, right? And the only reason why California is putting in 1,000 megawatts of it right now is they just did 1,000 megawatt RFP for geothermal power, right? And so when you do an all requirements bid in many of these places, geothermal doesn't get to the top of the list, right? And so I think part of this is the regulators really understanding that what we've learned is by letting the free market just go amok, and I'm a huge capitalist, as you know, that sometimes you end up with suboptimal planning decisions. And so whether it's pumped hydro, which we have many projects that we spec'd out in the 1970s and 80s that never got built, or whether it's geothermal, that some of these resources really do play a vital role in providing diversity of supply on the grid so that we can better handle weather events and other things. And they're worth investing into, even if it's not more than 5% of the grid.
Hey, a couple of questions by Clark Bullard, former DOE official, University of Illinois professor. You may know Clark from your time at the
university. I do know Clark well.
I thought you did.
A good friend.
I figured this is sort of like old home week here. Clark's asking, can you compare a little bit to deal with, say, 5 days of, cool, calm weather in the Northeast or cold weather in the Northeast? Compare the economic costs of storage versus building high voltage direct current transmission lines.
Well, this storage, is
the implication by Clark isn't storage sort of a better, more distributed solution that's less expensive?
It's only less expensive if it's subsidized, right? And so this is the thing, right? So like when you look at most of the models, it shows that we end up with 300 gigawatts, sorry, of storage, right? Where you would imagine if you were going to solve this problem with storage, it'd be 1,000 gigawatts of storage, right? But the reason it's 300 is it turns out that there's only a certain amount of storage that people are willing to subsidize, right? And when I mean subsidize, I mean you buy it for other reasons. Like you might buy a car with a 76 kilowatt hour battery in it, and you're buying it because you like a car and you want to transport yourself places. And when you plug it in, you're happy for it to be plugged into a bi-directional charger, and then we can use that battery to back up the grid, which is great, right? But it doesn't solve the transmission issue, right? So it solves the issue locally, so you can get much higher utilization of your distribution circuit, but it doesn't solve the problem of if there's a lot of solar and wind. As you know, there are huge interconnection queues for solar and wind right now in MISO and PJM. And those transmission lines are not really able to move the power to where it needs to go, right? And so the question becomes, if you wanted to improve the ability to just say yes to all those people. Let's say you just said, you know what, screw it. We don't need an interconnection queue. We're just going to say yes to all of those people, and we'll just curtail them if we have a problem, right? And so there'll be like, unplanned curtailments all the time, right? Well, then if you're a developer, you might say, well, wow, if we're going to move to that, I need to put in a lot of storage so that I don't lose that power if I get curtailed. I need to save it, and then I need to like sell it at a time when the transmission grid is not fully utilized, right?
Isn't that sort of the market working, Jigar?
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. But then the alternative to you as a developer is you can pay an extra 2 cents a kilowatt hour to put in an HVDC line from there to the population center using the Department of Transportation right of way or the rail right of way, because those are the ones you can do quickly. And then they have to do the math. That's the market working, right? Is it an extra 2 cents a kilowatt hour, right? Because right now, renewable energy players are used to paying 2 cents a kilowatt hour to ship their power from the bus bar to the population center. My guess is that if you wanted to rush an HVDC line along a certain corridor, you probably have to pay 4 cents a kilowatt hour, right? So now, because you have to underground 20% of it, let's say, because there's some barriers in the way, 4-leaf clovers on highways and that kind of stuff.
And the railroad corridors make a lot of sense.
Absolutely, you could do the railroad corridors too. You see the Sue Green project, and they've done a lot of that. But it's like 4 cents a kilowatt hour, let's say, right? And Sue Green's making money because they're able to help MISO and PJM balance their loads. But that's not going to be universally applicable to all wind centers to population centers. So let's say it's 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So now you do the math as you suggest with the market, right? Either you build a lot more storage at your facility and then you just use the transmission lines as needed, right? Or you pay an extra 2 cents a kilowatt hour above the 2 that you would have paid to be able to like have a bigger pipe that you can then ship the power down to the population centers, and the storage now goes into people's electric vehicles or into their Tesla power walls or something like that, as opposed to having the storage being at the generator site, right? But I think that those things have been modeled, and sometimes, as you know, we don't follow the model. Sometimes you follow what people's heart desires, and they want to put storage on site as opposed to building an HVDC line, or vice versa, right? And we have to be able to answer those questions through the loan process that we have, right? Because every one of those people can come to us for a loan, whether it's the HVDC line developer or the battery storage deployment folks at the wind and solar site. Both have the right to come to us with a loan, and we have to ask them, what's the reasonable prospect of repayment? What is the chances that you're going to pay me back, right?
And sometimes all those market things get distorted by lots of state subsidies floating around and federal subsidies of different sorts. And
that's right.
That's part of the process as well. Let's talk a little bit about Justice 40.
Yeah.
The Biden administration has said, we have a strong commitment to environmental justice communities. Justice 40, we're going to look to channel 40% of federal investment in the clean energy sector to benefit communities, environmental justice communities, communities of color that have had underinvestment over the years. How does your program work with that? And is that more about distributed energy and DERs and trying to figure out ways of building out in communities so you get jobs there, investment and growth there? How are you sort of bringing together the Loan Program Office and Justice 40?
It's a good question, and there are many aspects to Justice 40. So I want to make sure that I'm clear. Like, I'm not minimizing the other aspects of Justice 40. I'm just answering your question around how we can help on Justice 40. And we have more limitations compared to, the rest of government. And the other thing I'd say is it's 40% of the benefits go to justice communities, not the investment. And the reason that matters is because my office makes money for the federal government. So I'm not actually adding to the investment dollars because we're getting paid back. So our score from CBO is practically
it's really
zero
high
because we're, well, I mean, like, they could give me an extra $100 billion of loan authority and the score would be practically zero because, like, I'm paying it back, right?
And
So
Senator Domenici, who created the program, was known as a fiscal conservative, a Republican who focused on balancing the budget and finding ways of engaging the federal government in ways that, as you're putting it, produces money rather than loses money.
Well, that's right. And the way that I have looked at the Justice 40 environment, as we talked about with the virtual power plants and the solar financing, is that there are a lot of people, like if you think about the Barbara Einrich view of the world, where there are a lot of poor people who are nickel and dimed, right? The question becomes like, so for instance, when a low moderate income consumer has a refrigerator that breaks, they're very concerned about fixing it right away because they have $85 worth of food in there that might spoil, right? So they don't want to lose. And so what ends up happening is they might get a $750 refrigerator and pay $950 for it because that's the only group that'll give them a 12% interest loan at $950, so they can get one that day. That equates to a 30% interest rate on the original $750. We have the ability to intervene there to make sure that people put in connected refrigerators, connected water heaters, connected smart thermostats and HVAC units, give them the original $750 price, lower the interest rate tremendously, and spread the term so that's not 3 years, but 10 years. And we could give them the option to get opted into a DER aggregator so they can get payments from FERC Order 2222 once that gets implemented, right? And many of these folks may not actually be thinking about this because, why would they be obsessed with FERC Order 2222? Most of us
rolls off our tongue if you're an energy wonk, right?
Most of us are accused of having, most of us are accused of having mental issues for talking about
I had a conversation with someone today in which my colleague Brad Klein and I kept talking about PURPA, and it took us a moment to tell people Public Utility Regulatory Commission 1978. Oh,
no, that's exactly right. But it's not just refrigerators, water heaters, and heat pumps. It's also electric vehicles. Electric vehicles become a grid resource. So, right. There's over, $1 billion a year of subprime auto loans, which we can also convert into much more affordable loans with electric vehicles. And then, we put in bidirectional charging, and so now there's a value there too. And so I think part of this is recognizing that low, moderate income consumers are actually paying the highest prices for these basic services. And if we can intervene and make sure that we create trust relationships so that they can take advantage of these connected devices and get these secondary payment streams, not only are we reducing the interest rate they're paying up front, but we're also giving them secondary revenue streams by which to pay the original payment. And to me, that is a far more intelligent way of supporting these communities and moving to electrify everything.
And that ties into community solar as well, right?
Sure, of course.
Of aggregation that you can support through the loan program for 2222 if it gets passed. Do you want to talk?
Oh, it's already passed, my friend.
Yes,
now it needs to get implemented.
Yes, get implemented, get done. I know it got passed. All right, got me there. Community solar, just your thoughts on the opportunity to really aggressively develop community solar. You know how much interest there is. How do you see that playing out?
I think community solar is a great opportunity, right? I think that we obviously did a lot of it when I was at Generate Capital before I took this job, so I certainly know a lot about it. I'd say the biggest thing for me is trying to figure out that if the market is going to pay a premium for the power that comes from these services compared to, let's say, a utility scale project, then the question becomes, what social goals do we want to achieve from that premium, right? And so I'm very supportive of these, low, moderate income requirements on community solar. And I'm also very interested in seeing community solar get integrated with the state energy offices around all this money that's coming from the bipartisan infrastructure deal, right? We've got huge amounts of money on weatherization, huge amounts of money for clean appliances in the Build Back Better Act that we hope to pass here pretty soon. And so it would be nice to make sure that if someone signs up for community solar, that they also get opted in to all these other programs that are available so that we can really help them reduce their energy burden.
Pull it all together.
Yeah.
All right. Last question. You've been generous with your time, and I know we need to move to wrap up. Just what are the technologies out there that you're just really excited about that there hasn't been as much conversation on, like hydrogen, where there's a lot of conversation? What's out there that you think, Jigar, everybody here who's on the webinar, we ought to take a look at this for the future?
Well, I mean, look, I think, as you know, I have been working in areas that are boring for my whole life, right? I mean, the reason I did solar was I thought it was boring, that I thought
energy efficiency, best,
right,
fastest, cheapest solution to climate change problems. It's
right,
boring.
Right.
But it's less expensive, it's easy to do, it creates jobs, it avoids and reduces pollution. But ho hum, it's just energy efficiency.
That's exactly right. And so I work very hard to make each one of these sectors as boring as possible, because that is the bridge to bankability. That's when you get $1 trillion, is when everything looks boring and, sort of in the rearview mirror is when banks are willing to really open up their wallets. Right. And so I think that the next generation of technologies will be diverse. And I think that many of us who have been working on this for a long time have gotten used to picking 2 or 3 technologies, but I think we're going to have to realize that we need a piece of all of it, right? And that includes small modular reactors, it includes micro reactors, it includes green hydrogen, it includes advanced geothermal, as we discussed, but I think it also includes CCS. Remember, the leading state in the country on CCS is Illinois. They've had a working Class 6 well with ADM for 10 years, right? The expertise globally on Class 6 wells is in Illinois, right? And, and so I think it's important to recognize that ethanol plants have the most pure CO2 stream coming out of their industrial process. It's remarkably cheap to capture. It's less than $27 a ton to capture their CO2, put it into a pipeline and stick it into a Class 6 well, right? But, and the 45Q credits are $50 a ton, maybe going up to $85 a ton. And so the return on investment there is very high. And so you could imagine you could build a pipeline from, you know, South Dakota all the way through all these states, collecting all of this CO2 to do carbon sequestration and storage, right? And so, and I get it. There's been a lot of high profile failures in Australia and Texas and other places. But I think it's important for us to recognize that if we're really serious about getting to net zero, we're going to have a suite of these solutions. If you'll permit me one more thing,
Go for it.
I would say that it is very important that we start implementing and deploying, right? I mean, when you think about all the cities and towns that I'm from, Sterling, Illinois, or from, you know, other places around the Midwest, who still have not converted their street lights to LED, or their traffic lights to LED, or put solar on rooftops, or figured out how to, you know, like, or they're not even close to being prepared to get their share of the money on electric buses to convert their bus fleets, right? I mean, we are in a weird place where we have a lot of people now in our industry working super hard to lobby the state legislature and the House of Representatives for the federal government, but they're not spending the same amount of time on city council members and mayors to get them to really implement the last mile of stuff that's already cost effective.
That's called let's get it done and implement it. All right. Thank you very much, Jigar Shah, for everything you've done before you joined the Loan Program Office, which is robust and important. Thank you for what you're doing now for everybody across the country and what you will be doing. And I look forward to talking with you soon.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.